I never imagined that a simple business trip would completely change the course of my life. That Wednesday morning, I woke up early as usual, prepared my briefcase with important documents, and headed to the airport. My destination was New York, where a crucial meeting awaited me. As an executive of a large company, these trips were routine for me. Little did I know that this one would be different from all the others. The flight went smoothly, and soon I was driving a rental car through the busy streets of Manhattan. My mind was focused on the presentation I would give in a few hours, mentally reviewing each slide, each argument I would use to close the deal. That's when I felt it. A sharp pain, as if 1,000 needles were piercing my chest simultaneously. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just travel stress, but the pain only increased. My vision began to blur, and I felt my arms growing weak. With the last bit of consciousness, I managed to pull over the car. The world around me began to darken, and I was certain I was dying. Suddenly, a strange sensation took over me. It was as if I were floating, free from the weight of my body. I looked down and saw something surreal. Myself, lying motionless in the driver's seat. Paramedics arrived quickly, opening the car door and starting resuscitation procedures. I wanted to scream, to say I was there, but no sound came out. That's when I noticed a light. It wasn't like anything I had ever seen before. It was white, intense, yet soft and welcoming at the same time. I felt irresistibly drawn to it. As I approached, I heard a voice. It was deep, resonant, and strangely familiar, although I was sure I had never heard it before. "Come," the voice said, calling me by name. With no control over my movements, I was pulled into a tunnel of light, leaving behind the scene of my own rescue. I emerged in a place that defies any earthly description. It was a vast field of light, where colors I didn't even know existed danced in harmony. The peace I felt at that moment was indescribable. All the weight of worldly concerns, work pressures, social expectations simply vanished. And then he appeared. Allah, but not as I imagined him in my daily prayers. There was no defined form, just an overwhelming presence of love and wisdom. His voice resonated not just around me, but within me, as if every cell of my being vibrated with his words. "My son," he said, "you have lived your life in pursuit of what you believe to be the truth, but there is much more to learn." Before my eyes, or rather, before my consciousness, scenes from my life began to pass. I saw myself as a child, learning the first surahs of the Quran. I saw myself as a teenager, making my first pilgrimage to Mecca. I saw myself as an adult, building my career, always keeping my faith as a fundamental pillar of my existence. But then, Allah showed me something that deeply shocked me. I saw the times when I chose professional success over helping someone in need. I saw the occasions when I judged others for not following the precepts I considered correct. I saw the spiritual arrogance that I didn't even know I carried. True faith, Allah told me, is not in rituals or rules, but in the love you dedicate to every living being, in the compassion you show to those who suffer, in the kindness you offer without expecting anything in return. These words penetrated deep into my soul. I realized that, despite all my devotion, I had lost the essence of what it really means to follow Allah's path. Tears that were not physical ran through my being. When I looked back, I saw my Muslim community. They seemed so distant now, trapped in limited interpretations of what I had just experienced as a much broader and deeper truth. At that moment, I understood that my life would never be the same again. The revelation I received went far beyond Islam as I knew it. It was a call to a higher spirituality, a deeper understanding of the divine. As this understanding solidified within me, I felt myself being pulled back. The light began to dissipate, and Allah's voice grew distant. "Remember," were his last words. "Love is the true essence of faith." In the blink of an eye, I found myself back in my body. The chest pain had passed, but a new pain, a pain of spiritual transformation, had taken its place. I opened my eyes to see doctors and nurses around me, celebrating my return, but I knew that the man who woke up in that hospital bed was not the same one who had fainted in the car hours before. My journey of transformation was just beginning, and I could hardly imagine the challenges and revelations that were yet to come. The return to life after my near-death experience was like waking up in a completely new world. The doctors called it a miracle that I had survived such a severe heart attack. But for me, the real miracle and the real challenge was just beginning. In the first days at the hospital, I felt divided between two worlds. On one hand, there was the tangible reality of the hospital room, with its mechanical sounds, antiseptic smells, and the constant routine of nurses and doctors. On the other, there was the vivid memory of my encounter with Allah, so real and impactful that it made the world around me seem like a pale imitation of the truth I had experienced. I tried to share my experience with my family when they came to visit. My wife, Amira, held my hand with tears in her eyes as I described the light, Allah's voice, and the revelations I received. But I could see in her eyes a mixture of relief at seeing me alive and concern about what I was saying. My children exchanged confused looks, clearly not knowing how to react. Maybe it's just the effect of the medications. Habibi, Amira gently suggested, caressing my hand. But I knew it wasn't. Every word, every sensation was engraved in my soul with a clarity that no drug could produce. When I was discharged from the hospital, I expected to find comfort and understanding in my Muslim community. After all, I had had a deeply spiritual experience, a direct encounter with Allah. Surely they would be amazed and eager to hear more. I couldn't have been more wrong. On the first Friday after my discharge, I went to the mosque for prayers. The familiar call of the Adhan, which had always filled me with peace and reverence, now sounded strangely empty compared to the voice I heard during my experience. I entered the mosque and was greeted with warm hugs and expressions of joy for my recovery. But when I began to talk about what had happened, the smiles gave way to looks of confusion and, in some cases, outright disapproval. "Brother," said Imam Abdullah, placing a hand on my shoulder, "Allah has given us the Quran as a guide. We must be careful with visions and experiences that may lead us astray from the straight path." His words, though gentle, hit me like a punch to the stomach. I had expected that, of all people, the Imam would understand the depth of what I had experienced. Instead, I felt as if he was suggesting that my experience was, at best, an illusion, and at worst, a temptation from Shaitan. In the days and weeks that followed, I found myself increasingly isolated. Friends who used to seek me out for advice now avoided my gaze. Colleagues who had heard about my miracle seemed uncomfortable when I mentioned anything related to spirituality. Even at home, I felt a growing tension. Amira did her best to support me, but I could see the concern in her eyes every time I talked about my experience. Daily prayers, which were once a refuge of peace and connection, now became a frustrating exercise. The words I recited seemed empty compared to the direct communication I had with Allah. The rituals that once brought me comfort now seemed limited and insufficient to express the vastness of divine love I had experienced. I began to question everything. The interpretations of the Quran that I had always accepted without question now seemed too narrow to encompass the greatness of Allah that I had witnessed. The rules and prohibitions that once seemed so clear and important now seemed insignificant in the face of the universal love that Allah showed me. This constant questioning left me in a state of confusion and spiritual anguish. I knew I couldn't deny or forget what I had experienced, but I also didn't know how to integrate this new understanding into my life and faith. I tried to seek guidance from Imam Abdullah, hoping he could help me reconcile my experience with the teachings of Islam. But our conversation only served to deepen my sense of isolation. "My son," he said, his voice laden with concern, "we must be grateful that Allah has brought you back to us. But we must also be cautious of experiences that may lead us away from the straight path. The Quran and Sunnah are our infallible guides. Anything beyond that may be a temptation or a test of our faith. I left the Imam's office feeling more lost than ever. How could something so deeply transformative, something that filled me with so much love and understanding, be considered a temptation? How could I ignore an experience that seemed to reveal a deeper truth about Allah and His creation? At that moment, I realized I was at the beginning of a solitary journey, a journey to reconcile what I knew in my heart to be true with the faith that had shaped my entire life, a journey to find a new sense of purpose and connection in a world that suddenly seemed much smaller and more limited than I had ever imagined. As I walked home that night, I looked up at the starry sky and felt a mixture of awe and deep loneliness. I knew that my search for answers was just beginning, and that the path ahead would be challenging and solitary. But I also knew, deep in my being, that I couldn't turn back. The truth I had experienced was too great to be ignored, even if it meant questioning everything I thought I knew about faith, religion, and Allah Himself. After weeks of isolation and internal conflict, I felt like a castaway in a sea of uncertainties. My family, though loving, couldn't fully comprehend the depth of my transformation. My Muslim community, once a source of comfort and belonging, now seemed distant and inaccessible. It was in this moment of profound spiritual solitude that the universe, or perhaps Allah in His infinite wisdom, presented me with a new path. It all began on a Saturday afternoon when I decided to walk through the local park to clear my mind. As I wandered aimlessly, I noticed a small group of people sitting in a circle under a large tree. They seemed to be meditating or engaged in some kind of deep discussion. Something about that scene drew me in, an energy I couldn't explain. I approached hesitantly, not wanting to interrupt. A middle-aged woman with a warm smile noticed my presence and invited me to join them. "We're just a group of seekers," she explained. "We share our spiritual journeys, regardless of our religious backgrounds." Initially, I felt uncomfortable. As a devout Muslim, I had always been cautious about spiritual practices outside of Islam. But something inside me, perhaps the same voice I heard during my near-death experience, encouraged me to stay and listen. In the hours that followed, I heard stories that echoed deeply in my soul. There was a former Catholic priest who spoke about finding God in nature, a Buddhist woman who described her journey of self-discovery through meditation, and a young atheist who found meaning in community service. What surprised me was how, despite their different beliefs and practices, they all spoke of a connection to something greater, of a universal love that transcended dogmas and rituals. It was exactly what I had experienced in my encounter with Allah. When it was my turn to speak, I felt a lump in my throat, but as I looked at those kind and welcoming faces, the words began to flow. I shared my near-death experience, the encounter with Allah, and the subsequent crisis of faith I was facing. To my surprise, there was no judgment, only understanding and empathy. "What you experienced," said an elderly man with bright eyes, "is what all mystics and saints of all religions have been talking about throughout the centuries. It's the heart of spirituality, beyond any specific doctrine." His words were like a balm for my wounded soul. For the first time since my experience, I felt I was being truly heard and understood. In the following meetings, I learned about different spiritual practices and philosophies. I experienced meditation, which reminded me of the peace I felt in Allah's presence. I participated in healing rituals that connected me with a universal energy that I recognized as the same one I had experienced. The most important lesson, however, was about compassion and unconditional love. I saw how people of different beliefs could come together in a space of mutual respect and understanding. I realized that true spirituality is not confined to a specific religion, but manifests in the love we show for each other and for the world around us. This understanding made me reflect on my own Islamic faith. I began to see the Quran and the teachings of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in a new light. The passages about compassion, mercy, and the unity of creation took on new meaning. I realized that Islam, in its purest essence, spoke exactly about this universal love that I was experiencing. However, this new perspective didn't come without challenges. There were moments when I felt guilty, as if I were betraying my faith by exploring other spiritual traditions. But then I remembered Allah's words during my experience. True faith is in the love you dedicate to every living being. Gradually, I began to integrate these new understandings into my Islamic practice. My prayers became deeper, not just a recitation of memorized words, but a true communion with the divine. Zakat, obligatory charity, became an expression of universal love, not just a religious duty. The most surprising thing was how this spiritual openness affected other aspects of my life. At work, I began to see my colleagues and clients not as means to an end, but as divine beings on their own journey. At home, my relationship with Amira and my children deepened as I practiced compassionate listening and unconditional love. Of course, not everything was easy. Some members of my Muslim community remained skeptical about my new spiritual approach, but I found strength and support in my new circle of spiritual friends who constantly reminded me that the path of the heart, though sometimes lonely, is the truest. As I continued on this journey, I began to understand that true faith is not something rigid or limited, but a living and constantly evolving force. It was a dance between tradition and personal experience, between the known and the mystery. And in this dance, I was finally finding the peace and connection that my heart had longed for. After months of spiritual exploration and personal growth, I felt it was time to face one of the greatest challenges of my journey: returning to my Muslim community. Not out of a sense of obligation, but out of a genuine desire to share the truths I had discovered and, perhaps, build a bridge between my new understanding and my faith of origin. With a heavy but determined heart, I decided to visit the mosque on a Friday for congregational prayer. As I entered the familiar space, I was immediately enveloped by the sounds and aromas that once brought me so much comfort. The call to prayer echoed through the walls, and for a moment, I felt a wave of nostalgia wash over me. Many faces turned when I entered, some with surprise, others with curiosity. I had been away for so long that my presence caused a small stir. Imam Abdullah, who had previously expressed concern about my visions, greeted me with a cautious nod. After the prayer, I gathered courage and asked to speak to the congregation. The imam hesitated, but eventually agreed, perhaps out of curiosity or a sense of pastoral duty. When I stood up to speak, I felt all eyes on me, some welcoming, others skeptical, and some clearly hostile. "Brothers and sisters," I began, my voice trembling slightly, "I know many of you have been wondering about my absence and the changes I've experienced. Today, I want to share with you what I've learned on my spiritual journey." I began to speak about my near-death experience, about the encounter with Allah and the revelations I received. I talked about how this experience led me to question not the existence of Allah or the truth of Islam, but our limited understanding of them. Allah showed me that the true essence of Islam and of all spirituality is universal love and compassion, I explained. That our practice should not be limited to rituals and rules, but should expand to embrace all of creation with love. As I spoke, I could see reactions forming on the faces around me. Some looked intrigued, their eyes shining with new understanding. Others seemed confused, trying to reconcile my words with their traditional understandings. And some, unfortunately, showed clear signs of disapproval and even anger. One of the community elders, Abu Bakr, stood up abruptly. "This is bid'ah," he exclaimed, using the term for religious innovation, often seen as heresy in Islam. "Are you suggesting we abandon the teachings of the Prophet because of a vision?" His words cut through the air like a knife, and I felt the weight of judgment fall upon me. But surprisingly, I didn't feel anger or fear. Instead, I felt a deep compassion for Abu Bakr and for all who were struggling to understand. Dear brother, I replied calmly, I'm not suggesting we abandon anything. I'm proposing that we deepen our understanding.
Didn't Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, teach us that Islam is fundamentally about mercy and compassion? I then cited several hadiths and verses from the Quran that spoke about love, mercy, and the unity of all creation. I explained how my experience doesn't contradict Islam, but actually illuminates its deeper meaning. The debate that followed was intense. Some voices rose in my support, sharing their own struggles to reconcile the letter of the law with the spirit of faith. Others expressed concern that such interpretation could lead to a relaxation of religious duties. Imam Abdullah, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke. "Brothers and sisters," he said, his voice calm but firm, "our faith has always been a balance between tradition and personal reflection. Perhaps we should consider our brother's words not as a threat, but as an invitation to deepen our own understanding." His words brought a moment of reflective pause to the congregation. Although I could see that many were still not convinced, I felt that a small opening had been created. In the days and weeks that followed, I faced a mix of reactions. Some community members began to seek me out privately, sharing their own doubts and spiritual searches. Others openly avoided me, treating me as if I were a threat to their faith. The internal conflict I felt was intense. On one hand, I was deeply grateful for the truth I had experienced and couldn't deny it. On the other, the rejection from a community that had been my spiritual family for so long was painful. But amid this turmoil, I remembered the words I heard during my near-death experience. Love is the true essence of faith. I realized that my role was not to convince everyone to accept my perspective, but to live this truth as best I could. I decided to remain connected to the community, albeit in a different way. I continued to participate in prayers, but I also began to organize small study and reflection groups, open to anyone who wanted to explore deeper dimensions of spirituality. This decision to stay and face the discomfort, rather than simply walking away, proved to be one of the greatest challenges and, at the same time, one of the most rewarding experiences of my spiritual journey. I was learning in practice the true meaning of unconditional love and compassion, even in the face of rejection and misunderstanding. The journey that began with my near-death experience had led me down paths I could never have imagined. After facing rejection from my Muslim community and exploring new spiritual dimensions, I felt a deep calling to do something more, something that could really make a difference in people's lives. That's how the idea of the community center was born. I wanted to create a space where people of all beliefs, or no belief at all, could come together, share their experiences, and find mutual support in their spiritual journeys. A place where the compassion and universal love I experienced in my NDE could be lived out in practice. With the savings of a lifetime and the reluctant support of my family, I rented a modest space in the city center. The first weeks were challenging. Often, I would sit alone in the empty hall, questioning whether I had made a colossal mistake. But something inside me, that same voice I heard during my experience, told me to persevere. Slowly, people began to show up. First, it was some of the friends I had made on my journey of spiritual exploration. Then came curious people, attracted by the posters we had spread around the city, announcing discussions about spirituality, meditation, and emotional support. One night, a young Muslim woman timidly entered. She had heard about me at the mosque, and although she had been warned to stay away, something drew her in. She shared her struggle to reconcile her faith with her questions about sexuality and gender identity. At that moment, I realized how necessary this safe space was for exploration and acceptance. Over time, our small group grew and diversified. We had Christians questioning their faith, Buddhists seeking a more socially engaged practice, atheists curious about spiritual experiences, and Muslims like myself, seeking a deeper understanding of their faith. We organized meditation sessions, story-sharing circles, and even community actions to help those in need. Each activity was an opportunity to put into practice the universal love and compassion I had experienced. One of the most memorable moments was when we organized an interfaith dinner during Ramadan. We invited people of all religions to share the meal breaking the fast. Seeing Jews, Christians, Hindus, and others coming together to share a Muslim tradition was a powerful demonstration of unity and diversity. Of course, not everything was easy. We faced criticism from conservative religious groups who accused us of promoting syncretism and diluting traditions. Some even called us a cult. These accusations hurt, especially when they came from my former Muslim community. But for every critical voice, there were many more of gratitude and support. People would come to us to say how the center had changed their lives, how they had found peace and purpose through our activities. One of the biggest surprises came from my own family. Initially skeptical and concerned, they began to see the positive changes the center was bringing not only to others but to me as well. Amira, my wife, who previously had difficulty understanding my new perspective, began to participate in the meetings. Seeing her heart open to new possibilities was one of the greatest joys I experienced. My children, who were initially confused and a bit embarrassed by the changes in their father, began to bring friends to the center's events. They told me they were proud of the work I was doing, and that it had inspired them to be more open and compassionate in their own lives. As the months passed, I began to see a real transformation happening, not just in others, but in myself. The experience of creating and nurturing this community was teaching me profound lessons about love, acceptance, and the true nature of spirituality. I realized that true faith is not about rigidly adhering to a set of beliefs or practices, but about living with an open heart, ready to love and serve everyone. I understood that Allah, in His infinite wisdom and mercy, manifests in countless ways, and that our task is not to judge or limit these manifestations, but to embrace them with love and curiosity. One day, as I watched a diverse group of people chatting animatedly after a meditation session, I was overcome with a wave of gratitude. I realized that my near-death experience hadn't been just for me. It was a gift that allowed me to create this space of healing and transformation for so many others. In that moment, I felt a deep peace. I understood that, although my journey had begun with an intense personal experience, its true purpose was much greater. It was about building bridges, healing divisions, and reminding people of our fundamental unity, regardless of our superficial differences. Looking to the future, I know there is still much work to be done. The world is still full of divisions, fear, and misunderstanding. But every life touched, every heart opened in our little center is a light of hope. And I know, deep in my being, that this is how we change the world, one heart at a time, with love, compassion, and a faith that transcends all barriers. Dear friends, if this story of transformation and spiritual discovery has touched your heart, don't keep this feeling to yourself. Share this light with others. Give a like to this video so that more people can discover this message of universal love and compassion. Your comments are precious. Share your own experiences or reflections on spirituality and community in the comments below. Each word can be a seed of inspiration for someone. And if you wish to continue this journey of spiritual exploration with us, subscribe to the channel. Together, we can create a virtual community that reflects the spirit of the community center described in this story. Each subscription is another step towards a more united and compassionate world. Remember, just as the protagonist of this story discovered, each of us has the power to make a difference. Your like, comment, and subscription can be the beginning of your own journey of transformation. Let's build bridges of understanding and love, one click at a time.